Hi, everyone. Welcome to 3GNY Stories Live WEDU Wednesday. Thanks for joining us tonight. I'm Gail Peck, 3GNY Vice President and grandchild of 2 Holocaust survivors. This is our 21st WEDU Wednesday. This also marks our 1-year anniversary since we launched this virtual series as a way to bring our educational initiative WEDU from classrooms to your living rooms during a challenging year. For those joining us for the first time, 3GNY is an educational nonprofit for grandchildren of survivors and supporters. As a living link, we preserve the legacies and lessons of the Holocaust. Our mission is to educate diverse communities about the perils of intolerance and to provide a supportive forum for the descendants of survivors. For tonight's event, we'll be featuring guest speaker Farah Kraus, 3GNY's treasurer and WEDU co-chair. Farah keeps our books organized and is always on top of our finances. She is also responsible for ensuring all of our WEDU classes run seamlessly. She does all of this work as a volunteer alongside a full-time job. I couldn't be more grateful for her dedication and friendship. At this time, I'd like to share a brief video. It's a look back at the past year of WEDU Wednesdays and the incredible stories we've heard. Have a look.
In 2006, we established 3GNY as an educational nonprofit organization. And this forum that we established, where we could finally articulate our family stories, led to our establishing in 2009 our education initiative called WEDU.
In 2013, I took the WEDU class with 3GNY, which Allison just told you all about. That class forced me to learn as much as possible about my family's history.
If not for WEDU, to actually take the time to sit down and write it all down and present it, to be connected to schools. That was just absolutely incredible.
And now more than ever, it just feels so imperative to share my grandparents' stories and remember them.
When I think about my grandmother, I think about baking with her, dancing with her at my bat mitzvah, cooking with her, spending holidays with her, and also about the horrors that she endured.
Behind my grandmother on the left is her childhood home, and this is where she lived with her 2 brothers and her little sister.
The name Night of Broken Glass, or Kristallnacht, came because the following morning, November 10th, all of the streets were littered with glass.
When Grandma Dina and Rena had been in Auschwitz-Birkenau for about a year and a half, Joseph Mengele arrived.
Steffi arrived at the ghetto, and she was forced to undress and was robbed of all of her personal belongings.
They directed my grandfather, his father, and his younger sister Franca to the right. His mother Gitla and his older sister Hannah were sent to the left.
And his sister was crying, and his mother was crying. And the father said, "I don't have any money to give you." And the soldiers started ransacking the apartment.
A year later, when my grandmother was 17, she and her family, her sisters and her mother, were taken to a concentration camp in Plaszow, Poland.
His dad painted the first sign that said Concentration Lager Auschwitz.
Imagine trying to shave this man and those like him with a straight razor. If he bleeds, you die.
Using the knowledge of car engines and machines from her childhood, she purposefully sabotaged the airplane parts in ways that the untrained guards wouldn't recognize.
Miracle of willpower, immense amount of strength, and luck allowed my grandfather to be one of the only 7 members of his entire 78-person family to survive.
The one particular cemetery I was interested in, amongst over 1,000 Jewish cemeteries in Poland, was being restored.
A photo at my engagement party 3 years ago of maybe a quarter of the family that Hitler tried to destroy.
I'm so proud of you. What can I tell you? So very, very proud of you.
And thank all of you for, being interested and participating and being so active. Thank you. And what I say, shalom.
As you just saw, our WEDU volunteers gave this their all, and they do the same in school classrooms. Thanks to their commitment and dedication, we now have a permanent archive of our stories, which can be viewed on YouTube. Since we began our virtual programming, we've been able to reach more than 16,000 viewers, and WEDU Wednesdays alone have raised almost $17,000 to date, which allows us to run 11 more WEDU classes, training a total of 130 additional individuals. That's 130 more stories to be learned and told, 130 more survivors remembered, 130 more stories that won't be lost. Tonight's event is in honor of Eva and Harry Kostre, and it has been generously sponsored by Iris and Harvey Kraus. Thank you so much. If you're interested in sponsoring an event or program, please let us know. It is because of the support of our community that we continue to do this impactful work. In other exciting news about our organization, we've officially helped launch 3G Philly and are bringing 3GNJ under our umbrella. These groups are our first two regional affiliates. We've come a long way since our founding in 2005 with a group of 6 3Gs. Tonight's program showcases 3GNY's flagship educational initiative, WEDU, which is short for We Educate. To talk more about WEDU and introduce our speaker, I'd now like to call on Leora Klein.
Thank you, Gail. My name is Leora Klein. I'm the grandchildren of 4 Holocaust survivors and a founding board member of 3GNY. WEDU is a 4-week training program that empowers grandchildren of survivors to learn and compellingly share their families' Holocaust experiences in school classrooms and community groups. With the steady uptick in anti-Semitic acts across the globe, our work has taken on new urgency. Studies have shown that students who receive Holocaust education are more tolerant and comfortable with people of different races and backgrounds. They are more willing to challenge incorrect or biased information and are more likely to be upstanders. Through our grandparents' testimony, we talk about the importance of stepping in early and often when small injustices are committed, whether on the playground, in the classroom, or on the neighborhood streets. By the time laws are passed restricting civil rights, it is far too late. 3GNY has trained over 300 speakers in New York, New Jersey, Washington, D.C., and we've continued to train around the country on Zoom since the pandemic hit. We've spoken in more than 500 classrooms, and we have impacted more than 31,000 students. And between our live programming and YouTube channel, more than 16,000 new people have heard our stories. Hope is not lost, and we need to keep doing the work now more than ever. You can help us accomplish this through a financial gift. Your donation will go directly toward training more speakers, thus reaching even more students. We provide our programming to schools completely free, and we aim to keep the cost of training to 3Gs to a minimum. There is a link in the chat with ways to donate. If you've already donated to 3GNY, thank you so much. And as Gail mentioned earlier, if you want to sponsor an event or program in honor of a survivor, please be in touch. Thank you again for being here tonight. You are helping us honor the memories of our grandparents and ensuring that never again is more than just a phrase. It is now my personal pleasure to introduce you to Farah Kraus. Farah is the grandchild of 2 Holocaust survivors. She became involved with 3GNY in 2010 as a trainee in the WEDU program. To date, she has spoken to over 60 classrooms and is continually amazed at the insightful and thoughtful responses from the students. As WEDU co-chair, Farah enjoys helping other participants prepare to speak in classrooms. Farah majored in finance and business economics at Indiana University. She currently works in her family accounting practice and lives in Brooklyn, New York. Farah, I want to express my deep gratitude to you. You are both the foundation and the roof of our organization. Farah's precise accounting mind and generous heart has helped run WEDU expertly while ensuring our speakers build the confidence to present to students. All the while, she ensures that each member has a meal or a gift for significant life milestones. But none of this fully or properly conveys the countless hours Farah puts into 3GNY and WEDU. Without her effort, her dedication, and her continuous commitment to excellence, we would not have trained as many grandchildren and not have reached as wide an audience as we have to date. Farah, It's really my honor to introduce you.
Thank you, Leora. Before I share my Bubby Eva's story in honor of the 1-year anniversary of WEDU Wednesday, I'd like to thank some of the people who have made this possible. First, my parents, Iris and Harvey Kraus, for sponsoring this evening, and my mom specifically for making sure I always understood the importance of my family history in relation to the world we live in. Also, my cousins, Beth and Michelle Pollock, for introducing me to 3GNY and the WEDU program they helped develop. Dan Brooks for thinking up 3GNY. Leora Klein for so many things. She was there the first time I shared my grandmother's story for students in a New Jersey classroom. Gail Peck for creating the speaker series as a way for 3GNY to continue sharing our family stories and grow our reach during the pandemic. David Watts for his commitment to 3GNY as our president. He's been behind the scenes for a majority of the WEDU Wednesdays. Dave Reckes, who's part of our amazing team and running the tech tonight. Alexis Fishman, Lori Klugman, Elizabeth Commons, and the rest of the WEDU committee and our wonderful facilitators, along with the 3GNY board, past and present. And of course, the fabulous Peter Nelson for sharing his wisdom while leading our WEDU classes. And last, but certainly not least, all of you for joining and supporting us this evening. While I'm sharing my grandmother's story, I'm also going to try to point out where I engage students throughout the presentation. So, meet my grandma, Eva Kostre, born Chava Golchinka, and she's standing in front of her childhood home in Trzcianne, Poland. Trzcianne was a small town about 25 miles northeast of Bialystok, the nearest city, and my grandmother is the younger child here. She's about 8 to 10 years old in this picture. And when my grandmother talked about her childhood, she always described it as paradise. She says she really doesn't remember a lot of anti-Semitism growing up. She remembers maybe once in school, people saying things about Jews being lazy. And she came home and told her mother, and she said, what do they know? We all work really hard, and pretty much brushed it off. In this picture, when I look at it, I tend to see a shack, but my grandmother always described her house as one of the largest in town on the main street across from the main church. And at this point, I usually ask students if they know what matzah is. And that's a good way for me to know if the students have ever engaged with Jewish people, if they've gone to their Jewish friend's house. And the reason that I ask that is because then I describe the two windows are my grandmother's kitchen and dining room window. And when she was young, they used to make matzah before the holiday of Passover as an extra way to make money because her father had passed away when she was about 5 years old. I'm going to show a few more pictures of my grandmother's family. On the left, there's some of my grandmother's sisters, and of course, they are sitting in front of the same windows. And on the right is my grandmother's sister with her husband who was in the Polish army before the Second World War. Sorry about that. And these pictures on the left, it's my grandmother's father and his mother, my grandmother's Bubby Bailey. And I find the right picture very interesting because it's a picture that was sent to family in New York of my grandmother's two brothers. The rest of the 9 siblings were sisters. And I think it's interesting because the family in New York only received the picture of the boys, so they actually didn't know that the girls had been born at all. Now, when the German soldiers first came into my grandmother's town in July of 1941, my grandmother was taken by surprise. She didn't really expect it. And I always ask the students who in the classroom is an oldest child, who's the youngest child. And I do that, and then I ask them, you know, as an older child, do you ever think you try to protect your younger siblings from things going on in the family? And do younger siblings ever feel like they were being protected? And I do that because I think that's what happened with my grandmother. She was the youngest of 9 siblings, and I think they tried to keep things from her because as soon as the soldiers came into town, her oldest brother had said, we aren't going to live for this king, which makes me think that he had some idea of what was going on. Now, my grandmother said at first, things didn't change that much. The soldiers were actually polite because her house was in the center of town. They would come in to get a drink of water and to have their shoes shined. And then one day they came into the house and they apologized to my grandmother's mother, my great grandmother. And what they apologized for was what they were about to do, which was they were about to start burning down Jewish houses. At first, my grandmother's family ran to a neighbor and they hid in their potato ditch. And the little boy who lived in that house insisted that his mother feed them and let them stay there. But after one day, they said they did not feel safe having Jews in their backyard anymore. And my grandmother and her family ran into the woods. And the one thing that my grandmother talked about was the mosquitoes in the woods and how uncomfortable it was. And at some point, they were rounded up and brought to a mill basin underground. And they were there for a few days. And at that point, the one thing happened that I never heard my grandmother speak about in person. And that's that her oldest brother was asked to dig a hole and he was shot into it. After that, they were actually able to return to their home. And my grandmother says she remembers about 50 people living in her home at one point because so many houses had been burnt down and there wasn't really anywhere to go. And then after a while in November, all the Jews that were still alive in my grandmother's town and some of the surrounding little towns were rounded up and they were brought by horse-drawn wagon to a transit camp. And the only way I could describe this from what I've heard, because I've never seen any pictures of it, is baseball dugouts really low in the ground. And that's where everybody was kept. And my grandmother says they were very lucky because her sister knew somebody and was able to get a job in the kitchen. And at night, she was able to bring back the potato peels. So they weren't even eating potatoes, but they were eating the skins of potato. And that did keep, my grandmother was with one of her brothers, two sisters, her mother and her grandmother, and all of them stayed alive. And my grandmother, though, does remember a lot of people passing away and having to carry a lot of the bodies out. After a while, they were then loaded up onto cattle cars and they were brought to Auschwitz. And the first thing that happened when they got there was the women were separated from my grandmother's brother. But then they started to separate the women. And my grandmother and one sister were sent one way, and her mother, her sister, and her grandmother were sent another. And at that point, my grandmother didn't know that there were gas chambers in Auschwitz, or really what Auschwitz was, but she did know that it would be better if you could work. And she felt that her mother and grandmother were very weak, and she wanted to be with them. So she threw a blanket over her head, and she crossed over in line to be with her mother. A German guard saw her, called her a stupid cow, and threw her back in line with her sister. And that saved her life because her mother and grandmother were immediately taken to the gas chamber, and she and one of her sisters were taken and processed into the camp, which meant that they had their hair shaved and a number tattooed on their arm. My grandmother's number was 28214. When my grandmother first arrived, the first job that she was assigned was laying the stone roads. And she said the work was difficult, but the absolute worst part was going from the barracks to work because the roads were muddy and you would have to carry 2 rocks with you. So to walk, you'd have to put a rock down and then pick up another rock and move it. And she said if you got stuck, nobody was going to help you. You'd just get shot. After a few months, my grandmother's sister got sick and passed away. And at that point, my grandmother really did feel like she was all alone. And there was one thing that she did once a week, and that was that she would trade with 3 sisters. There was very, very little food in the camp. And every day my grandmother was given a piece of bread that none of you would really consider bread, a little bit of soup that none of you would consider soup, and a little bit of coffee that, again, none of you would really consider coffee. But once a week, my grandmother was also given a small piece of meat. And for whatever reason, she decided that she would rather have another extra piece of bread than a piece of meat. So once a week, she would go to these 3 sisters in another barracks, and she would trade a piece of meat for a piece of bread. And then one day she went to trade, and the sister said, look, we don't have any bread this week, but we'll trade you a handkerchief for your food. And at this point, I asked the students, do you know why someone who is actually truly starving would trade food for a handkerchief? And I don't expect the students to know the answer. It's just a way of me checking in and making sure they're still with me at this point in the presentation. The reason why my grandmother was willing to trade a piece of food for a handkerchief was because of something called selection. So every day, all the Jewish prisoners were lined up and people were chosen to go to the gas chamber. And my grandmother said if you were healthy and clean, you were less likely to be selected. So if she had a handkerchief, she could clean herself up and she'd live to the next election. Now, what happened is my grandmother got caught with the handkerchief, which had been stolen from a German guard. They knew enough to know that my grandmother didn't have access to steal this handkerchief alone. So they asked her, where did you get this handkerchief from? And this is a story my grandmother told a lot. And what she always said was, I wasn't stupid. And I knew if I told them where I got the handkerchief, they'd kill me and they'd kill the three sisters. So she said she didn't know. They wanted so badly to know where my grandmother had gotten the handkerchief that they lined up all the women in the camp who might have had access. And they said, fine, if you don't know their number, what do they look like? And at that point, my grandmother just said, I don't see very well and it's dark when I trade. I don't know. And my grandmother said, obviously they knew she was lying. And she said she could actually remember the conversation they had amongst themselves about, what do we do with her? Should we send her to the gas chamber? Should we hang her to set an example? Should we feed her? Like, what should we do? And what they decided to do is really what ultimately saved her life. They sent her to the punishment brigade in the camp. And the reason that saved her life is because there were no Jewish women. They were all German women who were petty criminals and political dissidents of Hitler. And my grandmother had heard rumors that the guard of these women was the toughest guard in the whole camp. So her first day under her command, the job, which was really just wasting time digging holes, my grandmother sort of decided that she would rather die from working too hard rather than being beaten to death. So she started digging as quickly as she could. And sometime into the first day, the guard came up to her and he said, what are you? To me, that's a weird question. I don't think anyone's ever asked me that. But my grandmother knew what he meant, and she said, I'm a Jew. And he was really taken aback because his whole life he'd been raised to think that German Aryan women were the strongest women in the world. And here he had this little Jewish teenager who was working harder than all of them. And he actually told her to slow down. And he had an odd respect for my grandmother. After her 6 months with him, she was sent back into the Jewish population of the camp. When she got back to her barracks, there was nobody left who was there 6 months before. And the guard had sent her back with what he thought the best job in the camp was, which was being a night guardsman. My grandmother did that job for one night, decided she absolutely wanted no part in telling other people what they had to be doing. And I have no idea how, but she somehow got word back to him that she wanted another job, and he made it happen. Another thing was he was also able to tell her where to stand at selection so she wouldn't get chosen. And then a lot of the German women who were prisoners became low-level guards in the camp. And because they had been prisoners with my grandmother, they looked out for her a little bit. And most important to my grandmother, they let her choose some other people who they'd also look out for. So my grandmother got to feel a little bit human, being able to take care of some other people, which was very important. So one of the things that they did do to help her was she was assigned some factory work. And because she was a little healthier looking than a lot of other prisoners, she was told to fill the fire with coal. And one of the guards said, you know, that's going to obviously kill her. You need to find something else for her to do. And that's what they did. Now, my grandmother survived over 2 years in Auschwitz. And then the Allied forces were getting closer into Poland. And so my grandmother was taken from Auschwitz, which you could see underlined on the right side of this map. And she was marched all the way to Ravensnbruck. When I speak to students, I ask them if they know where Toronto is. And the reason I do that is because the distance between Auschwitz and Ravensbrück is very close to the distance between New York and Toronto. I also remind them that they did this in January and February, and they were wearing nowhere near the right type of clothing for this kind of walk. When my grandmother arrived at Ravensbrück, after over 2 years in Auschwitz, it's Ravensbrück that she described as being like death. And the reason she said that was because she said nothing was going on there at all. People were sitting in the snow just waiting to die. And the female guard who was in charge of Ravensbrück at the time is actually known for saying it was too expensive to waste a bullet on a Jew. If you didn't feed them, they would die eventually anyway. My grandmother got extremely lucky at this point and was moved to a satellite camp called Malchow, where she was assigned a job of portioning food. And just, she said, having something to do was very important, but also because her job was portioning food, she was able to pick a different person every day to get just a little bit extra food, and that helped her to go on. Then in May of 1945, my grandmother was being marched out of Ravensbrück in the direction of the Baltic Sea when she was liberated by the Red Army. And she says that that was really the first time she allowed herself to cry for everything and really everyone that she knew she had lost. And also the Russian soldiers basically said, all these houses are empty. You could go into any house and you could take anything you want. And so my grandmother went into a house and she looked around, and under the bed, she found a pair of shoes and some money. And she took the shoes and she didn't take the money. And the reason that she didn't take the money is not because she was above stealing at that point. It's because my grandmother fundamentally understood paper money, and she understood that paper money has no value if there's no government behind it. And my grandmother said after what she'd seen of humanity for the last 3 years, she just didn't believe that there was a functioning government left anywhere on the planet. At that point, my grandmother was taken to a displaced persons camp because she had nowhere else to go. So she was brought there to recover. And here are a couple of pictures of my grandmother about 6 months after she got to the DP camp, because she never would have let anyone take pictures of her when she wasn't looking well. And in the right photo, you can actually see my grandmother is the young woman acting as an older woman. She never got that stooped in real life. But one of the things that she did at the DP camp was she joined an acting brigade, and they used to travel to all the different DP camps. And my grandmother felt like it was a way of just bringing a little bit of life back to everyone. Unlike a lot of survivors who married fairly quickly in the DP camps, my grandmother felt like getting married in Germany would be like getting married on bloody territory, so she chose not to. Also, at one point, she did try to go to her hometown in Poland, and she was told if she crossed into the town, she would be killed. But as she was leaving, she did notice her mother's candlesticks were still in the window. In 1949, my grandmother finally got permission to come to the United States. And after coming through a port in Boston, her first stop was family in New Orleans. When she got to New Orleans, there were two things that she didn't really like. The first was that her family there was very wealthy and very Americanized, so she felt uncomfortable. And they also wanted her to remove the numbers from her arm and to marry an American. And my grandmother said that as much as she wanted to move forward with life, she also didn't want to forget what had happened to her. And the second thing is something I asked the students about. What in 1949 New Orleans would make someone who had just gone through something my grandmother had gone through uncomfortable? And the interesting thing is that the students tend to know the answer or not based on what's going on in the world at the time. But the answer is, of course, segregation. And the first time my grandmother experienced segregation, she went home to her uncle and she said, "What is going on here?" And he said, "Well, it's better than it used to be," which was technically true, but still completely unacceptable. And at that point, my grandmother said, "What's wrong with you? Don't you know if they could do this to one group of people, they could do this to you? How could you live like this?" But my grandmother did stay in New Orleans long enough to go to night school and learn some English. And then she told her family that she was going to visit a friend in Chicago, which she did do. But then she got on a bus and took herself to New York. And when I was going through some of my grandmother's stuff, I found a letter from the family in New Orleans saying, "We heard you got a job in New York, ? Let us know when you're coming back. We'll send the bus fare. My grandmother never went back. And one day she was riding the subway and she met a gentleman who also had numbers on his arm. And they started to talk and they realized that they both had siblings who had gone to Argentina before the war. And they made a date for that night. And then my grandmother realized that she already had a date that night. So she ran home and she knocked on the door of the other single Jewish woman in the building. And she said, listen, I made 2 dates tonight. You'll come with me. They went out. Both of the couples actually ended up getting married. And over here is a picture of my grandmother and my grandfather about a year after their wedding at my great uncle's wedding. And they had 3 daughters and they lived a tough life. My grandfather worked in a sweatshop. My grandmother used to do some sewing and she also worked in a matzo factory at the right time of year. They eventually saved up so they could have a rental property. They had 4 grandchildren. I'm one of them. And now there's a great grandchild, my nephew, Adam. And then a couple of years after my grandmother got married, when her oldest daughter, my aunt, was 2, she actually went to Argentina to visit her sisters who had survived because they left before the war. And my grandmother said that was the moment where she really knew that everything was going to be okay. And over here, I have a picture of my grandmother a little more than 10 years ago in my mom's kitchen. And you could just see that she was a really bubbly person. She'd never let anything get her down. I can't remember anything getting her down for more than a very short while. And one of the things that my grandmother always said all the time was every day is a holiday. And when I was a kid, I thought that was great because when Bubby was coming, we were going to McDonald's. But as I started to learn my grandmother's story, I realized that that small phrase came from a bigger phrase that she had said, which was every day in the camps was a lifetime and every day not in the camps is to be celebrated. So it's a holiday. And so whenever I think of my grandmother, I think about the phrase every day is a holiday. Thank you so much for listening.
Farah, thank you so much for gifting us with your family story. It's impressive that you shared this in more than 60 classrooms, and we're so glad to hear it tonight. We're now going to open it up for questions. If you have a question for Farah, please type it into the Q&A and we'll do our best to address it. If we don't get to your question, please email info@3gnewyork.org and we'll get back to you. So the first question I have is about speaking in 60 classrooms, which is amazing. And of all those times speaking to students, is there a moment that stood out to you?
So when I speak in classrooms, it's an amazing experience. And a lot of times, sometimes, I always scan around the classroom when I'm speaking. And sometimes the students who I don't make eye contact with surprise me the most because they'll ask the best questions, or at the end, they'll come up and shake my hands because they're so happy that someone came to share a personal story with them. Unfortunately, I think the most memorable incident was an incident where a student asked me if I felt guilty about being Jewish. And after pressing a little bit more, it's because he thought all the conspiracy theories about Jews were true, controlling the weather and controlling the banks. And so I explained that not only weren't they true, but it was very cold outside. I did not like the cold weather. And if the Jews controlled the weather, it would be more like Miami at the moment.
That's good. Thank you, Farah. I've heard your story before, but listening it is like, there's so much detail there that I just can't believe. Which brings me to my question. How did you learn your grandmother's story?
So when I was a kid, my grandmother used to share little bits of her story here and there, usually like the handkerchief story, the parts of the story where my grandmother felt like she was a little bit in control of her fate because so much of what happened was pure luck. So anything that happened where my grandmother felt like it was her decision that made the difference, she used to talk about it a lot. But all the little details I actually learned after taking the first session of the WEDU class. I went down to the Holocaust Museum in DC, and I watched her show a tape. At the time, it was harder to access it in a lot of places. And I was able to find the corresponding information in the encyclopedias. So I was able to put together the timeline for the story.
Amazing. Thank you.
So I have a question about from a WEDU alum, Avital Barnia. She says, thank you, Farah. She wanted to know about the town. You were talking about the comparison of the distance between Ravensbrück and Auschwitz and how far that was.
That's a great question. And I want to say 640 kilometers about, but it could also be half that because I actually do not remember. I'm sorry.
That's okay. So a next question that has come in is, you said that your grandmother's siblings escaped to Argentina, some of her sisters before the war. A, do you know how they were able to do that? And B, why did she feel that everything was going to be okay once she saw them?
So to the first question, they didn't really escape so much as since my grandmother was the youngest of 9, they were a lot older than her. And her father recognized that there was really no way for economic prosperity for them in Poland. So as they got married, Argentina was one of the few countries that it was pretty easy to go to as a Jew. So as they got married, they would go to Argentina. So I think 3 or 4 of her sisters were able to go probably in the 1920s. And the reason I think my grandmother felt that everything was going to be okay when she was with them, it's because that was the first time she was with her nuclear family, since everything started to happen in 1941.
Got it. Are they still there? Like their children?
There are a few, yes, there's some family there. The family that I'm closest with from Argentina actually now lives in Israel.
Thank you.
Did your grandma and grandpa talk to each other about their Holocaust experiences?
I imagine that they did. My grandfather passed away when I was 5 years old, so I don't really know any of his story from his point of view, but I have to imagine that they did talk to each other. I know my mom always said when they didn't want anyone to know what they were saying, they spoke in Polish. So I imagine they spoke to each other, but I don't know that.
Another question is, did your grandmother know when the soldier that pulled her from the selection line from the gas chamber to the work line, did your grandmother know where her mother was going?
She definitely didn't at that immediate moment. I have to assume that within a couple of hours, she knew exactly where she went.
And how old was she at the start of this?
That's a really good question. I think that she was about 15 years old when the soldiers first came into her town. So she was probably just about 16 at this point.
This one is from Alexis Fishman. She says she's curious to know briefly what your grandfather's experience was.
So what I know of my grandfather's story is he survived with 2 of his brothers. I think they pretended to be electricians in Auschwitz to survive. And he gives a lot of credit to his oldest brother, David, who my brother is named for. But unfortunately, after the 3 of them actually survived together, David was shot in Poland after the war before they were able to come to the United States.
Because of anti-Semitism?
Yeah.
Wow. A question about some of the students. You mentioned that you try and gauge their level of knowledge by asking them if they know what matzah is. Do the majority, or do they know what matzah is, the audiences that you're speaking to?
It obviously depends on the audience. When I'm speaking to a Jewish audience, I throw it in as a joke. And then it really depends on the neighborhood. Some neighborhoods, even if I don't have Jewish students in the classroom, they are familiar with Jews. They've grown up and probably been in their friends' houses over Passover. And once in a while, it's rare, but I do, even in New York City, sometimes come across a classroom where kids aren't sure, but that could also be a classroom where English isn't a first language for the students. So it's hard to know if there's a translation error or they really don't know.
Okay. And how is your story typically received? I know 60 classrooms, so there's probably not a typical, but can the children take it in?
Yeah, I'm actually always very surprised about how well received the story is. In the 60 classrooms, I could still picture every student who absolutely like either put in headphones or put their head down. And I don't think it was more than a handful. In a lot of the schools we go to, especially because we try to reach students who aren't as reached, the kids are really appreciative that someone took the time to come speak to them. Also, a lot of students have family trauma of their own. They might not have a Holocaust story, but a lot of people's families escaped something coming to the United States, and they're able to relate really well to the story.
Incredible.
And I know, speaking of your story, this story is used in our WEDU training program to help train other 3Gs to share their stories like you. How does it make you feel that you're kind of like the role model and the example for, everyone's story?
Well, I think it would make my bubby very happy to know that so many people are hearing her story and learning about her. I don't know exactly how I feel about my story being the model. We have many other speakers whose story could equally be the model. I do make sure people know that it's just one example, and all of our speakers tell their stories very differently. I like to think that when speakers use their own personality and their own relationship with their grandparent, that's the best story, because we're trying to create some sort of like emotional, empathetic relationship. So people who are more bubbly tell the story more bubbly, but I'm not a naturally very bubbly person. So if I went into a classroom like that, the kids would be like, who is this crazy woman? So, like everyone has to use their own personality to tell the story the best. But I know my grandmother would be very happy that so many people get to hear hers.
Absolutely. And has your story or her story as told through you evolved over time? Like, did you change things after a certain number of experiences?
So for the most part, it's the same story, but I know if that first experience was recorded, I definitely have changed things over time, probably like a little subconsciously based on the response I see when I'm giving this story. Also, I recently, when my grandmother was first talking about the initial time that the Germans had come into her town, there was a lot of information in what seemed like a very small time frame, and it didn't make that much sense. And very recently, I found some Polish interviews from the 1940s that were finally translated into English, and it explained that the time frame was a little bit longer than I had originally thought it was. And then it actually made everything my grandmother said make more sense, because I was thinking September, why would there be mosquitoes in September? But knowing that it was really July, it then made more sense. So I did adjust that a little bit when I realized that my timeline was just shrunken together too much, but otherwise it's basically the same story.
Terrific.
Sorry. I have a question about when there were 50 people living in her house. Were they friends and other family? Do you have more info on like what that was like?
I really don't. Officially, her town was considered a ghetto. My grandmother never explained it that way though. So I don't really have a lot of information except for that her house was very full. And my assumption was always it was just probably people that they knew because it was a small town, but people who didn't have homes anymore.
And did your grandmother, with her 3 daughters, share her experience often to her children?
That's probably a question better left for my mom and her siblings. I think she probably shared different aspects of the story with each of them. And from what I loosely understand, she sometimes explained things in ways that she thought was better than what really happened and might have actually been a little bit more traumatizing. So I'm not 100% sure what my grandmother shared with her children.
This next one is from a 3G of 4 Holocaust survivors who's currently undergoing trauma therapy and wants to know if you have any advice for members of 3GNY and other 3Gs or anyone while going through this process of learning the story and telling it.
So for me, I think I was pretty lucky. I didn't experience any additional trauma learning the story. And I think I grew up with the belief that all the trauma was experienced by my grandmother. Now being a part of the community and having heard a lot of people speak, especially professionals, I understand that a lot of my traits and habits are actually a result of the trauma. But it's kind of been the same all my life. And I've never really experienced a different level of trauma listening to the story and telling the story, which is probably why I'm mostly comfortable hearing so many different stories in the training classes as we go through.
I think that's very interesting because we all in this community have grown up with a normalized version of intergenerational trauma.
Yeah.
And being part of this community or as an attendee of tonight's event, I think we're all just very grateful that this is not receding into the history books, but we're trying to, in addition to actively remember, we're trying to make sense of how it affects us as citizens of the world, as, as parents or as neighbor, like what do we do in times of discomfort when you know that something wrong is happening and you don't necessarily know how to change it. Our point being, speak up, like we can't afford not to. And you speak up, Farah Kraus, you're amazing.
Thank you, I really appreciate that. Actually, I used to speak up about a lot of things as a kid and I didn't even know why I was, but I just knew that it didn't seem right. And yeah, so.
That's great. Could have gone the opposite. You could have been taught to stay quiet because of the fear. Okay, I think we are done unless there's one more burning question that I can't read the chat anymore. So is there another burning question here?
So I just have one about when your grandmother passed away.
Oh, sure.
What's the question? When did your grandmother pass away?
Wow. I think it was May 4 years ago. And it was very sad, but my grandmother had also had like dementia at that point. So that was also really sad. It was really hard to lose my grandmother because she was really the last connection to the Holocaust, for the family. And I was already telling her story, but when she passed away, it made you realize that there weren't going to be a lot of survivors left. And now it seems like every week we hear about a survivor passing away. So it's more important than ever for us to continue to tell our family stories.
So Farah, thank you again for speaking tonight and for sharing your grandma's story. Our organization is truly, truly lucky to have you. And thank you, Leora, for being part of our program and such a valuable longtime asset to 3GNY. Thanks again to all of you for joining us. We're so glad you took the time to hear Farah speak words that must never be forgotten. If you haven't yet made a gift to support our educational programs, we hope you'll consider making one now. And please refer to the chat for ways to donate. Thank you so much. Also, if you have connections with educators who may want our speakers to present to their classes, please let us know. We have a large speakers bureau of grandchildren prepared and ready to present, just like you saw Farah do tonight. We'll send out an email tomorrow with information on upcoming events and a recording of tonight's program. You can also check out our past WEDU Wednesdays and other events on our YouTube channel. We'll also make sure you have the video that we showed tonight, the compilation of all the WEDU Wednesdays. Thanks again for taking the time out of your evening to be with us. We're grateful as always for your presence and support.